Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director of Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, I'm PR's Campaigns Officer. Hi.
So in this edition, we're trying to reflect on the rapidly shifting landscapes within which we work. At PI, we're constantly looking at developments around the world when it comes to tech, when it comes to data, when it comes to rights and power, and particularly the power of government and industry. And this is a bit of a special edition that we're trying out, a little bit more of a news-oriented approach to talking about things. We want to keep on doing our regular interviews because we get some fascinating people joining us to talk about what's going on in their parts of the world or their domains. But yes, this is just something new. So, you want to talk about something.
I did want to talk about something. So I was looking through interesting stories that I could bring to this conversation, and I spotted one on an outlet called Rest of World, which is a really interesting online outlet that looks at tech stories, but like outside of the UK, US. And what it was talking about was all over the world, people are shutting down their 2G services. So if you've got a mobile phone and you use data, use the internet, 2G I think is like the worst one left. It's like you're kind of in the middle of nowhere, you've got absolutely no signal, you might just have a little bit, and that's normally 2G. The problem is the way that mobile data works.
So there's this huge spectrum.
Yes, there is a spectrum.
And over time, we've gone from 2G to 3G to 4G, then to 5G. The spectrum is getting congested.
Yes.
And so the idea of turning off 2G is to free up the spectrum for other things and for more reliable communications on the other Gs.
Yes.
Which sucks if
you don't have a phone that supports kind of fancier internet, 4G, 5G, whatever it is. And millions and millions of people don't. So the Rest of the World kind of piece starts out talking to this guy in Vietnam. He's like 70, he sells kind of iced tea in a kind of street cart, and he just doesn't have internet anymore. Vietnam turned off their 2G, and people who cannot afford kind of posher, newer phones, which have 4G or 5G, they do not have access to mobile internet anymore. Vietnam was an interesting story in this kind of, because it's not Vietnam specific, countries, it's about 60 odd countries are turning off or in the process of turning off, have turned off their 2G internet. But what Vietnam did is they tried to distribute phones to people who...
Oh, really?
Yeah. So rather than just turning it off, Vietnam said, well, okay, millions of people don't have posher phones. They tried to give them out free. The problem with, as with all programs where you try and give people stuff for free, is they only get it if they know about it. And if you don't know about it, unless someone comes and finds you, which is very, very difficult to do, particularly if you're marginalised, particularly if you don't have like a persistent interaction with government, then you're not going to get access to these phones. And the kind of poorer end of societies globally, like a low-cost phone can cost like 30% of your monthly income. It can be a huge expenditure, even if you think about them as the cheapest phones imaginable. And the cheapest phones imaginable, like we did a project a few years ago, we went to Uganda, we picked up one of the cheaper phones that we could just in a random shopping mall in Uganda, and it was a phone that was no longer in security support, just straightforwardly. It was completely out of date, had no indication on it that it was anything other than a reasonable, good, new phone.
Also had a bunch of apps on there that were...
Oh, it was a terrible phone. It was a Google Play Protect phone, which had a ton of bloatware on it. It was a nightmare phone in terms of privacy, in terms of surveillance, in terms of your data exploitation. But if it's all you can afford, it's all you can afford. But even these cheaper end of phones, if they do have 4G and 5G, that doesn't mean that's the one that you're picking up off the shelf as new, because a lot of these phones they keep getting sold, or you're buying it off eBay, or like a similar bidding platform of secondhand stuff because you can't afford a new one, or because you think you want a slightly posh one, so you're trying to get a secondhand nicer one. Like, it could be one that just doesn't have access to these higher bandwidths of stuff. And so what starts out as, well, we want to free up kind of more spectrum space, we want things to work better for people, not very many people are using this, becomes, for those people that are and only have access to this form of mobile data, people can be completely cut off from the internet through their phones, which has become one of the primary and indeed sometimes the only way people have access to the internet, which has become, increasingly how people work, how people find jobs, how people communicate with government services, how people receive benefits, all sorts of other things that happen through their phones. And it's a persistent problem that we've seen with low cost technology, which is, like you said, a lot of these phones, the handset is cheap because the stuff that comes on it is designed to exfiltrate a ton of your data and to sell it on, and that's how it recoups the cost of the really cheap handset. And we've seen it a lot, and we've seen it, with the big companies like Samsung and kind of these Google Play Protect phones, which are a bit posher in some respects. And we've seen it with companies that target specifically at low-cost communities like Techno, which is this huge Chinese company we did some research on a few years back, which specifically targets features at communities in India it goes in, it localizes them, which is actually really cool. It's a really cool thing that they do, unless it's using it to target poorer people so it can sell them cheap phones to exfiltrate more of their data. And it's something that really gets missed in the privacy conversation, which is that if you are poor, you are even more screwed. We talk more about Pegasus and these individual targeted spywares, but a lot of people just can't afford good phones.
Yes.
That have any security support, have any protection inherent in them. And so, I just thought it was a really interesting story. I realized I talked for a million years.
I have learned the art of not interrupting you when you're making a good point. I have to say, from my silly perspective, having a kid and wanting to get the kid a phone, the first phone we bought him, actually, they didn't tell us when we bought it that it can't be used in the UK because it uses the old Gs. It uses,
Gs.
We needed to get a 4G if we wanted him to have any of the digital capabilities on it. We didn't want to have a full smartphone. He didn't want a full smartphone. We tried to buy a dumb phone, but it wasn't actually going to work. This is the catch with all of that, absolutely. But also applies to radio and TV. Mm-hmm. The move to digital is leaving behind loads of people who don't have digital infrastructure. I don't know if you follow the story in the US right now, but there's a little bit of a question as to what's going on with fiber in rural communities. And there's a cut of the programs to deploy fiber in rural communities, which was under the previous administration. And now the new administration is toying with, or at least the words are being articulated around using Starlink for it. I'm not mentioning any conflicts of interest because that's a whole other edition, but it is interesting.
Well, the Canadian government tried to, I think it was, where's Doug Ford governor of? Whatever he is.
He's the Premier of Ontario.
Ontario maybe had a program for rural internet that was with Starlink, and they've cancelled their contract with Starlink. Yeah, wow. As part of their beef.
Yeah.
Beef is an unserious word for a serious situation.
In our little world, we notice these things because we track the defense industry and the defense tech industry. And from the moment Trump got elected, the American defense tech industry was doing really well. Palantir went up 24%. But then as Trump started to annoy Europeans and Canadians, well, he's not just annoying Canadians, he's threatening to invade. All of a sudden, these firms don't look as appealing. Canada's talking about buying jets from the Europeans out of the blue and no longer for the Americans. And the French and the Germans are saying maybe we'll only buy European tech going forward.
Which is quite difficult to do nowadays. I think, I can't remember where it was, but there was some conversation about trying to buy European jets, but those European jets still had American engines. And there was some chip in that the Americans had put in the jet. But when the Americans were banning their export to Ukraine, it's because there is things in it that allows them to do that. It's not easy to just go, well, there are jets, so off they go, because that's not how interconnected supply chains work. Yeah. And nobody knows who we're going to go to war with in the foreseeable future, which is just wonderfully bright. Okay, so my first story is a little bit broader because it's about Google getting broken up, potentially. So any moment now, we're going to hear the result of an antitrust case around Google and whether it needs to be broken up. And the specific part of the question that's being considered in the upcoming case is about Google Chrome. There was an article recently how Google
begging not to be broken up, articulated that breaking up Google would cause threats to national security, which at first look was outrageous. At second look, we'd been warning about, which is the more that we rely on big tech for waging war, such as AWS, Amazon is the host of the UK intelligence agency's data. So what's the likelihood of a UK regulator holding Amazon to account? It would actually interfere with the security of the United Kingdom if the intelligence agencies had to remove their data from AWS. And so we foresaw this to some degree, but what's really interesting about the article is that Google's not wrong. Because Google, I love to hate the company, but they spend a lot of time making sure Chrome is secure from everybody but themselves. And they also spend a lot of time studying other systems to see if they're secure and notifying the companies when those systems aren't secure. And Google's essentially saying, if we get broken up, we won't have an interest in doing that anymore. And so national security will genuinely be at risk. Your devices might be less secure as a result.
Like, if Google got broken up, what would they get broken up into?
Well, Chrome would be taken away from them.
Chrome would be taken away from them and given to someone else, presumably hugely profitably.
It would be broken into a separate company altogether.
But then wouldn't that company also have incentive to make a good product?
It wouldn't have as much money.
True.
And it's kind of like what happened with AT&T in America in the 1980s. AT&T, being the sole provider of telecommunications, had become so big that it was doing so many other things. It was like one of the best research agencies on the planet. So much research funding and so much interesting research. They get broken up and then all those things start disappearing. So I'm not arguing that we need big, giant entities. It was just, these are very sophisticated conversations to be having. And Google is pulling out all the stops. Then this is where it gets interesting. Politically, Google has no friends. Nobody likes Google.
No.
Whether it's on one side of the political spectrum or the other side of the political spectrum.
Everyone hates them.
So they've got to play whatever they can. And today they're buying a security company for $9 billion more than they.
So this Wiz something.
Wiz. Yeah.
Wiz.
Yeah.
What a terrible name for a security company.
I know.
Oh yeah, I'm going to go work at Wiz. Bucket loads of Wiz is not. That's a very UK specific joke.
Very.
Ooh. But I mean, if Google or Alphabet is vital to US national security, surely another country doesn't care and could try and break them up.
Yes, but then once other countries start trying to regulate American big tech, because it's now called American big tech, it's no longer just big tech. These are considered moments of national pride for America, that their companies are so big and so dominating. Then you have J.D. Vance yelling at you for regulating your companies too much.
But they're registered in Ireland.
Yeah.
As they all are.
Yeah, well, they register in Ireland intentionally, not to be regulated too much.
Yeah.
Very well done. Very well done. These people are very clever, evil geniuses. Talking about evil geniuses, the next story is, well, people keep on saying Musk is a genius, but one of the things he did early on as part of Doge is that he declared that U.S. aid, generally the money that the U.S. government gives to other countries, deserves to be in the wood chipper. And yeah, on a Sunday night, basically, he shut down almost all U.S. aid programs around the world. And this is about $60 to $70 billion a year that's been taken off the table. And what's interesting is that most people don't know what's the role the U.S. plays in providing aid to the world when it comes to humanitarian programs and health programs. And so in the media, finally, we're starting to see the articles about what these programs are and who they actually helped. And this weekend in the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof wrote a beautifully represented piece, like with nice graphics and everything, showing how many people are going to die as a result of these cuts. And that's horrific and it's horrible. What we also have to note is the UK government announced that it's going to halve its foreign aid budget in order to spend that money on militarization. So they're saying we can't continue to help the world as much as we used to because we need to buy more toys or tanks. It's probably going to be toys, but one thing at a time. France announced it last year, so there's so much less money going around the world, like billions less. That includes to organizations working on human rights and other such things. But eventually aid will get turned back on again. We're not inhumane.
Also, the idea of foreign aid and international development money as a purely altruistic concept went out in the 90s.
I'm going to push back a little bit. It actually became real in the 90s. And up until now, when nobody was noticing, aid was quite depoliticized until a short while ago, it started to get politicized again. And this is the world we're waking up in, which is aid's not going to disappear. It'll just become much more transactional. The French will give aid to Morocco only if Morocco does something that the French foreign policy wants.
But what I mean is not necessarily like transactional aid. What I mean is thinking about aid as purely altruistic, as in we want to feed people because it's good to feed people, versus we want to feed people so they stay in their country and they don't come to our country, which I think has been increasingly seeing aid as an international geopolitical tool to achieve certain aims, not in the straightforwardly transactional sense in that either like we will feed your children so that you don't send more fentanyl across the border or whatever it happens to be, but the kind of more real politique world shaping, which is we will try and prevent famine in your country because if there is famine, then it creates either regional destabilization as people leave because they need to eat, or it creates more international destabilization or migration flows that a lot of governments have been finding challenging to deal with, both rhetorically, politically, in some cases practically.
I really want to disagree with you, but I can't, in the sense that let's look at PEPFAR, for instance. This is a Bush administration policy that he essentially developed with Bono from U2 and, has helped millions of people when it comes to life-saving drugs for people living with HIV. And they did it because it was the right thing to do. But at the same time, we were fighting the Bush administration who were pushing the UN Refugee Agency to start taking biometrics of all the refugees everywhere around the world in case it helped America get access to that data to determine who was a terrorist and who was not a terrorist. So it was definitely self-serving in a national security way. But what you're noting is I don't think the world recognized.
Yeah.
When we wrote a report on the idea that aid was being used to advance surveillance, we wrote this report in 2013, they had a hard time believing us until we were able to document all these programs. And then for the last 10 years, we've been documenting how EU funds have been going to Northern Africa in the guise of a trust fund for Africa, but really it was to advance surveillance programs to make sure migrants weren't traveling and that the police had the right tools to keep people in place. And what we saw in the first Trump administration, even as that administration was cutting U.S. aid, it was making sure that surveillance tools were showing up in Central America. So I think that's the world we're definitely moving into unashamedly now. That is, aid will only exist if it serves a national interest. And that's a very sad, cynical turn of affairs.
Very narrow definition of a national interest. Yeah. Like, the world is better off and the world's better off. And that's true wherever you live. But yeah, it's miserable.
Yeah, so we're going to have to make an argument to, say, the White House, say Trump at this moment, why we need to fund Ebola prevention in Uganda, because there's another outbreak. And we almost have to argue to him, but it could come to America, so that's why we have to do it. At which point he'll just stop all flights from Africa to America. And it's just such a painful way of having to do it.
Yeah.
But equally, I'm annoyed to hell that the aid programs that existed were already politicized and nobody was paying attention. And fortunately, about 2 years ago, we were able to make sure that EU aid programs, they have to do a human rights impact assessment before they do such a thing again. And hopefully we're going to have to do more of that for every country now, which is going to be exhausting but worth it.
We'll put a link, by the way, to the drivers of surveillance work in the description, as we always do, and we will do for each of the stories that we're talking about.
Yeah. Which story you want to talk about next? They're all like uplifting stories, aren't they? Do we want to do the one for Max?
Oh, what's the one for Max?
That umming and awing isn't a bad thing. Interjections are important for the flow of conversations.
Yes, but I think the problem with the medium in which we're doing this is that, terribly sad though it is for us, there it is, terribly sad though it is for us, terribly sad though it is for us, we're not having a conversation with the listener, we're having a conversation with each other. And though it might be useful for us to keep the conversation going to and to it's probably still quite annoying for the listener.
And that's why our editor has to always take them out.
Takes most of them out. I think if you try to take all of them out, he'd lose his mind.
But what we're talking about is an article we found in Knowable magazine that says that those quasi words like and huh, although they don't convey any information about the topic of the conversation, and they've annoyed linguists for a very long time as irrelevant noise, they are said to be crucial traffic signals to regulate the flow of conversations. Huh.
And it's different in sign language. In sign language, it's less disruptive to have two people talking at the same time, signing at the same time. But listeners often sign yes as a continuum for long stretches.
And they even cover the Canadian A, which I really appreciate.
A? I can't do a Canadian accent. I can't do any accents. Yeah. All my accents are offensive. All of them. I tried to do an Australian accent the other day, and I was roundly laughed at.
Umming and awing.
E.
Umming and awing.
A.
Okay, so with the situation, the conflict, the horrors that are taking place in Israel and Gaza, and of course there's also the West Bank where bad things are happening all the time. Well, first of all, hostilities have broken out again. There's many ways of saying that sentence I just said that is much clearer about who's to blame for what's going on. But I'm going to keep it simple because I want to talk about details of something, which is there's a lot of conversation about the use of AI by the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, as they target their missiles and other such attacks in Gaza. And since the outbreak of the conflict, there's been talk of how the IDF in Unit 8200 use AI to identify where they hit. And everybody thought, oh, this is a sign of the future. This is just how things are going to be. But actually, after the initial furore, we started to hear some critical sounds about what was actually happening. And of course, you could see the widespread destruction that was going on. And so there were two phases of developments in this, which is really interesting, and great work being done by 972 magazine, great work being done by Human Rights Watch, and this Christmas, or like late December, both the New York Times and the Washington Post did long investigations into what's going on. And I care very little about the AI itself. What I find interesting is the data that goes into the AI, because unlike in the West Bank, where the Israeli military and the Israeli government have vast amounts of data of people living in the West Bank because there's a relationship between the West Bank and Israel. There was no relationship between Gaza and Israel. There was no facial recognition. There was no fingerprints. There was nothing. It was a closed zone. So when they waged war, they had to find ways of getting access to data to decide who to target and where to target. So they relied on telecommunication systems that were essentially run by Israel. And with that, they could detect mobile phone movement signals. So when are people leaving a neighborhood? Then they can decide, okay, we're going to bomb that neighborhood. But then they realized that actually that data is not terribly reliable because maybe there's not enough electricity. People aren't plugged in. People might not have their phones on, and they were attacking neighborhoods on the wrong presumption. So the data was there, or they read the data wrong and did horrible things. So that's one source. And then as time went on, although they were saying, oh, this AI is going to be so perfect for making these decisions, it takes the passion out of the situation and instead just makes it based on facts, we started to hear critical words from the IDF itself, or senior officials saying, actually, maybe this isn't the right way. Or in the old days, when they were targeting, or any targeting situation arises, there's an individual that has to receive the data and say, that data is compelling enough for me to press the button. And in a way, they have to question the data. But when it's all in an automated way and they don't know where the data came from or how it was accumulated, but the system says go, the individual has very little opportunity to say, whoa, I'm not quite sure. So in early stages of this conflict, you had senior officials saying, oh, this is like the Matrix, this is amazing, this is so cool. And by December 2024, you're hearing this critical input saying, actually, we're not quite sure this is the right thing to do. And it's because it's about the data. We think that the AI makes things better, but really the AI relies on data. And in war, data is kind of shitty. It's hard to come by. It's not the thing you're focusing on when you're focusing on destruction. Yeah. And so it's just fascinating to see that. And it's fascinating to see how the IDF had to rush to deploy facial recognition. They had to find ways of getting the images of people and how many mistakes they've made as a result of that. There are countless stories about that now, which is good to see that journalism is being able to tell these stories, but it was also so foreseeable. Mm-hmm. Like we were silent in the early stages of all of this because we didn't know. We kind of knew how technology worked. We kind of knew where data came from, but we thought maybe we're missing an angle here. And unfortunately, we weren't missing an angle. It was going to be hard to do this right. And yet, this is where we are.
Was it 972 who put out the investigation that said how quickly human reviewers were approving AI-developed targets? It was like 3 seconds or something of people looking at it. And the adequacy of human review has been a pretty consistent part of our looking at these kind of AI decision-making systems, or algorithmic decision-making systems, ADM, in every field that they get deployed in workplace situations, in whatever, in all sorts of different situations. And the fundamental problem is, unless the human reviewer is given time, actual agency, actually understands what they're being shown, which is often just computer says probably yes, then it just isn't meaningful. Meaningful human review is quite hard to achieve and put into systems properly, and yet people slap it on and go, but there's a human reviewing it. It's not the algorithm making the decision, so it doesn't count like legally for your legal protections for like an algorithmic decision being made, because it's the human making the decision on the basis of the algorithmic information. It's like, that is not the same thing.
Yeah, and what kills me is that Mark Andreessen, who is the extraordinary Silicon Valley investor, when he gave a podcast interview to Lex Friedman in 2023, he's a huge investor in AI. He wants to see AI flourish. He argued for a world where humans are taken out of the loop and only AI is ever able to kill. Only an AI drone
one of the
can do
stupidest
things.
things I've ever heard.
But his point is that humans are constantly making mistakes, and the AI would not make such a mistake, he says.
What AI?
Yeah, I know.
Well, this is the constant problem.
The data bit.
The AI that you can imagine in your head, which is perfect and amazing, and it synthesizes all the possible data that exists and makes all the right decisions. It needs to get trained on something. It needs to be making perfect decisions. The only way it can make perfect decisions is to know that it's made perfect decisions in the past, which you can't do on its own anyway, because what is perfect? That's not a quantitative decision. It's a decision like someone makes, so they set the parameters of what perfect is. Anyway, so that's problem number one. Problem number two, that AI doesn't exist. People keep saying AI like it's magic. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist like anywhere. None of the Gen AI platforms aren't perfect. They're not perfect for like writing a sentence. It's certainly not a perfect sentence. They're not perfect at not making stuff up. They're not like, there is no AI system, and obviously AI exists beyond generative AI. It exists for much more narrow and specific purposes where it might be much better. But it's like the ones that we currently have are pattern recognition machines and pattern reproduction machines. Yeah. Like the idea that they will somehow make perfect decisions because there is a perfect decision and perfect means something in this context is insane. Yeah. It doesn't mean anything in war. What is a perfect decision?
Well, I can use an example of that, which is as the Americans were pulling out of Afghanistan, there was a bombing at the airport, and the Biden administration was embarrassed by that, so they decided to get retribution for it. And they used a drone to attack somebody they called an ISIS-K official. And 3 days later, Mark Milley, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs, he said this was a righteous kill. We did good here. And yet, at that time, the military was identifying the fact that this person was innocent. This person was actually a humanitarian aid worker who worked for an American organization, that his driving around Kabul, picking up and dropping things off, even though they were intercepting his communications and tracking the car over a whole day, where the interpretations by the armed forces was that he was doing something nefarious, he was actually just picking up people who worked for the organization, dropping them off. And the interpretation of him grabbing huge canisters and putting them into his car that were going to explode, he was actually picking up water to bring home to his family. And the safe house, where outside of which he used the Reaper drone and the Hellfire missiles on him, was his home, and 10 people were killed, including young members of his family. And that was what was being called a righteous kill. Now, for what it's worth, after that, the U.S. Department of Defense spent a lot of time coming up with guidance on how they make these very human decisions. So there's been progress in that regard, but what's been uncovered about how the IDF has waged war since the conflict began is that they've loosened all the rules they used to have about how many innocent people were willing to accept being hurt in a single attack. So they've widened those thresholds. And so AI would not solve any of these problems unless we get into this post 9/11 mindset, which is what intelligence agencies were arguing for back then. Give us more data. Then we'll be perfect. Give the AI more data. Give them all the telecommunications data. Give them all the database data that exists in all the records everywhere. Then the right decision. Oh, wrong decisions still happen? Okay, give them more. Give them more. Give them more. And this has never proven to be true. But it's proven to be a fact that this is what governments call for.
It's proven to be very sellable.
Yes, very sellable.
That's what I think investors like Andreessen and other people who massively overhype and overinflate AI companies, that's what it really is. It's just incredibly sellable because people don't know what it is. And so if you say, well, if we can only if we can have more data, we can finally make perfect decisions in war, then that will be possible, but it's just not a thing. Also, like, say in that situation, it's a bombing, it's terrible, we want to find the guy that did it, assuming he didn't die with the bomb. Like, even if you go through all the right channels and you find the exact right guy, is there a really, honestly, perfectly righteous kill that you can do? Because that's the ultimate problem with war. It's horrendous. It's horrific. There is no genuinely moral, perfect, ethical outcome. There's only least bad outcomes. So what are we talking about?
We're talking about very powerful governments who are embarrassed and who lash out using the full weapons of the state. That was Afghanistan, and that was Israel and Gaza. So
it is Israel and Gaza.
Yes, exactly. Totally. Is there a happy story we can end on?
Is there a happy story? There's a funny story.
Yeah.
So we have this email called Insider, PI Insider. You're very welcome to sign up. We would love you to sign up. It's a great email. Best email that anyone's ever sent. Anyway, I was looking through, checking all the links work, doing all that kind of stuff in the most recent version, and there's a Verge story about an AI pin, and it's half creepy. It's very creepy, but it's also very funny, which is this AI like transcription outsourced memory pin. And obviously there's never been any TV show episodes about how outsourced memory might be a bad thing. But the poor woman who was testing it for The Verge, she took it to the toilet with her by mistake and she forgot to mute it. And it put on her list of, it has little reminders at the end of the day, like things you might want to consider for the future based on the transcript I have of your day. And it added, maybe think about taking Lactate again because you've been having some symptoms that you're not supposed to be having anymore.
That's literally, start carrying Lactate again, recent dairy intolerance, symptoms returning.
And it's only like, that was like the first couple of days of her using it, and she keeps using it, and it's a really interesting story. It's worth reading. It's on The Verge, and it's called like the B AI pin or something. But I
outsourced my memory to an AI pin, and all I got was fan fiction. That's what it's called. What a great article.
Really interesting story.
I found that one.
I just thought that the lactate thing was particularly funny, partly because it's like genuinely a tiny bit useful, but like the only way to have that be useful is for someone else to record and transcribe your toilet pains, which is just a nightmare. It's just the worst. And it's a classic example of why privacy is important. I think it's an old Cory Doctorow one, which is if you got told that you were only allowed to poop, the only place you were allowed to poop would be a glass box in Trafalgar Square, you would hold it until you died, because not everything has to be nefarious for you to want to keep it private. There's a reason that bathrooms have doors. Yeah, and it's just the ultimate, not that.
Yeah, her write-up is extraordinary. And she even wants to be kind to it because she's tried a number of similar pieces of technology, and she says this bee is the most successful one that she's tried. And she's even happy to say that while it gives her the heebie-jeebies, this type of automated recording of everything, she says it's been entertaining and helpful at times. But she says she's still not sold on AI doubling as your memory. And she says, while it might be convenient of summaries of work meetings or podcasts, and that might be appropriate, she says, in other parts of your life, it's more like voyeurism, even if it is your life.
Yeah, well, she said she was going around on the bus with it, and it was transcribing other people's conversations, which she found really deeply uncomfortable. She was talking to friends. She tried to mute it. She handed it over to someone else. It didn't work. There's a really annoying mute button, and then it heard a personal conversation someone else was having that she felt horribly guilty about. It mixed up her life with the TV and screwed around with things like that. And she was like, yeah, the problem is if you talk to someone about grief, you don't really want the transcribed, highlights delivered to you later.
Or in the closing bit, she talks about how she had a fight with a family member and it transcribed it. She said, did it help me remember why I was angry? She said, yes. But she said, instead of moving forward, she just dwelt on those negative feelings.
If you look at the comments, actually, this is another thing I thought was really interesting. The top comment, or at least when I read it, says, forgetting is a defense mechanism of the brain. Being able to remember everything you do, think, talk about is not only dystopian, but pointless and possibly harmful. Which I think is true. Nice. Sometimes you just move on from stuff.
Yeah.
And just being able to endlessly go back and reread, I was really annoyed about the dishwasher. It's like, well, actually, I was tired. I was hormonal. And the dishwasher was not actually what I was annoyed about. But sometimes you just need to be able to forget and move on from stuff.
Yes.
Because it wasn't really meaningful.
Yeah.
There we go. I
think it's still one of the top stories on The Verge. I think people
really and we'll link it down below. It is really worth a read. It's really interesting and quite fun. It covers a lot of interesting ground.
Cool.
Well,
that's a nice way to end it.
Yeah, lots and downs.
Privacy dystopia in your own personal life. So let us know if you thought this was a good format. Also, if you ever have any suggestions of stories you'd like us to cover, please get in touch with us.
You can email us at info@privacyinternational.org.
It is at info.
Yeah. It is at info.
Because we're the two people that actually receive all the emails at info.
I don't receive
emails. Oh, you don't? Okay,
info,
I'm the only person I actually review all the emails going into info.
I don't know if you want to tell people that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but they will know that it will come to me.
That's true. We used to have a survey at pvcy.org/pod survey, which I might put back up. If you want me to put it back up, email us at info@privacyinternational.org.
Yeah.
And we got a really interesting range of feedback, some of which I put into my 360.
Yeah, because it's all
review.
positive about Caitlin. Yes, I know. I'm constantly reminded of that.
There was one nice comment. We got one nice comment about me and I screenshotted it and I used it in every presentation I've done ever since about the podcast. If you want to send balancing out horrible comments about me or nice comments about Gus, those are also available at info@privacyinternational.org. Or if you want to demand the survey go back up, then we would be very happy to do that.
Yeah, because feedback matters. Last time I got feedback that I swore too much.
Yes, so we started bleeping you.
Sorry. No, I started to cut back.
You started to cut back and we started bleeping you. And then in the most recent podcast recording, Max sent it back and I realised I'd also done a big swear.
Oh, really?
There was suddenly a bleep noise and I was like, oh, okay.
That's you.
Yeah, it's me too.
Okay. And so thanks for listening. This is a new format we're trying, and we probably forgot to hit record or whatnot.
Something up.
something somewhere might appear somewhere, we think. But thanks for listening. And you can be the first to learn more about our work by going to
pvcy.org/sign up, where you can also sign up to Insider, PI Insider, if you want more news stories that we're interested in.
And we'll include as many links as we can about the stories that we covered. There's a lot of them in the sense that, some of them go back a couple of years at least about some of the issues we've talked about. But I can't believe the quality of journalism we have today that is able to write about such interesting, hard, and funny things in such great ways. So we're very fortunate and we're very happy to be able to share this. You will be able to access that on any platform you listen or by going to our website at pvcy.org/techpill.
Well, actually, speaking of platforms that you're able to access things on, Spotify and some other similar platforms will let us upload video podcasts. I hate them. I find them really annoying, but if you think that they're fun and you prefer that, then let us know at info.privacyinternational.org and we will maybe think about doing that. I promise nothing, but yeah.
And don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. The music is courtesy of Sepia, and this podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International, with fewer ums and ahs.
I think there'll probably still quite a lot.
Oh, I thought we were great. I managed to get a Canadian A in there.
Hey.
Hey. Umming and awing.